Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. I'm Gila Alabi.
And I'm Oji Akbe.
Welcome back. I'm Veronica Adeka. After weeks of unnoticeable law and terrorist attacks in the northeastern parts of Nigeria, the decade-old insurgency seems to have come back with a vengeance. Only last week, the poster group of that insurgency, Boko Haram, made a telling statement in Damaturu, the capital of Yobe State, when hundreds of its members on utility vans launched a deadly attack using an assortment of sophisticated weapons, including surface-to-air anti-aircraft firepower. The Nigerian Army says it has also stepped up its operations against the insurgents. Now we have KABIR Adamu, a security consultant, joining us from Arise Studios, Abuja, to give us more perspective on this. Welcome to the program, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
It's great to have you on, and I just wanted to start by saying, because of the type of violence we've been experiencing during election, post-election, and also, too, there was sort of a sense that violence in the Northeast had quieted down before the elections, and I guess because the election violence took over, we have not been aware and maybe on high alert when it comes to violence in the Northeast. Recently, we have now been hearing of different violence. We have the bandits in Zamfara. We have the bombings rising up again. Can you give us a sense of why there was this lull, and were we being lulled into a false sense of security by this quieting down? And what is going on? Give us a sense of the lay of the land in the Northeast and why we had this sense of returning security when maybe that wasn't true.
Well, you are right when you posit that there was a reduction in the number of incidences that were being recorded in the Northeast, both from the point of view of the incident itself and then the casualty figure. Just before the elections, the Nigerian government revamped its counter-terrorism effort, mainly by the diplomatic approach. So it reached out to the neighboring countries in the multinational joint task force, and we saw an increased effort from both the Nigerian troops, the troops from Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. And significant to this is the launching of what they called Operation Yanchin Tafki. Yanchin Tafki is a Hausa word, which if you translate means to liberate the lake. In this case, Lake Chad. Mm-hmm. So we saw several interdictory attacks by mainly the Air Force components of these countries in the multinational joint task force, targeting locations where, in particular, the Islamic State in West Africa province had its stronghold around the Lake Chad region, and then in some border area between Nigeria and Cameroon, as well as around the Sambisa forest. So that, to an extent, led to a dislodgement of the group itself, that's ISWAP, Islamic State in West Africa province. And I guess they were trying to gather themselves together, which is why we saw a reduction of attacks before the elections. Now, significant is the fact that if they are dispersed, it means we would see a spread of attacks outside the locations that we were used to seeing. So we saw an increase in attacks in Madagali, in northern Adamawa State. You recall several instances where there were attacks in those locations. Then, of course, in Yobe State, we saw several attacks. And then, of course, the one you spoke about recently. In terms of that particular attack, which happened along the Damaturu Maiduguri road, we are not sure if they were about to launch an attack or it was the Nigerian military that ambushed them, because that particular area has been a known crisscrossing point for them for several years, actually. So if you recall, the Nigerian military said it had intelligence, and it used that intelligence to ambush the group. So whether they were targeting a particular location or they were going to attack that particular community, it's unclear. But what is a fact is that the Nigerian military was successful. They were able to destroy at least 2 of their gun trucks and capture several of the arms they were going to use for whether that particular attack or another future attack. So that's sort of what has been happening. Very significant too is the reduction in suicide attacks that we've been monitoring since around, I would say, October last year up until now. There has been a significant reduction in the number of suicide attacks by both Boko Haram and the Islamic State in West Africa province. I must mention that there is a difference between these two groups, the Jamaat al-Ahl Sunnah lil-Dawat wal-Jihad, which is called Boko Haram, and then the Islamic State in West Africa province. Our assessment is that it is the Jamaat al-Ahl Sunnah lil-Dawat wal-Jihad that is using young girls mainly to carry out suicide attacks. And because it has been disseminated by the government, frankly, we've seen a reduction in that suicide attacks. Islamic State in West Africa province, on the other hand, prefers to attack military targets, and most of the attacks on forward operating bases of the military is by that particular group. So in a nutshell, that's sort of the dynamics that has been playing out in the Northeast before election and then post-election.
It's always good to have you on because you really understand the framework of these organizations and you really help our audiences understand that. I do want to follow up with you on the Boko Haram suicide reduction and also the state of Boko Haram today in Nigeria. What would you say, I mean, has Boko Haram truly been disseminated, or are they in a rebuilding? Because also we were reading about some attacks. Give us a sense of where Boko Haram is today, and if we are making success, how to sustain those successes, and if we're not, what we need to do.
I would make some very measured statements in response to your answers. One is that when we're speaking of Boko Haram, let's be clear that we're speaking about the Jamaat al-Ahl Sunnah lil-Dawat wal-Jihad, which is the group headed by Shekau, the controversial Shekau. That group, it has been quote-unquote disseminated in the sense that it's not as active as it used to be. Its stronghold used to be the Sambisa forest. Most of the Sambisa forest is dominated by the Nigerian military, and of course with the support of our neighboring countries, especially Chad. So to that extent, I would say that particular group, Boko Haram, is not as active as it used to be 2-3 years ago. However, speaking about the Islamic State in West Africa province, which is the most active group right now and has closer links to the global jihadist group called Islamic State. If you recall, and if you're following developments in Syria and Iraq, you would know that the global group, Islamic State, has been more or less quashed by the forces, the American forces and other partners. So to that extent, we've noticed, we've monitored from late 2018 into 2019 an inflow of jihadists from across the world back into the folds of Islamic State in West Africa. There is a projection that the West African sub-region, and to an extent the larger Sahel region, is becoming the new stronghold for the Islamic State group, the global group. And to that extent, Islamic State in West Africa province is getting a lot of that increase in membership from these jihadists that are returning from Syria. So we've seen an increased attack by this particular group. And like I mentioned earlier on, their targeting has been mainly military bases, forward operating bases around the Lake Chad region. And Nigerian military has responded by closing a lot of its forward operating bases around the Lake Chad basin. They've increased their divisions, the bigger formations, mainly to reduce their vulnerability. You recall when a couple of months ago, over 100 soldiers were allegedly killed in one particular forward operating basis. So, and that particular incident was carried out by the Islamic State in West Africa province. Now, more recently, in late February into early March, we received information that the leadership of that particular group has been changed by the global body, IS. Now, we're not sure why that happened, because the former leader was the son of the founder of the group itself, that's Mama Yusuf. The new person named is relatively unknown. We knew him to be a commander of the group itself. So why they removed the son to name a member as the new leader, we're unsure. What that would portend for the group is also not very clear. Will that mean a change in their methods, a change in their tactics? We're not very sure. This is something that perhaps the next few weeks, months will unfold. Having said that, the Nigerian military has been quite aggressive in its current counter-terrorism campaign. I mentioned Operation Yanchin Tafki. It's been quite successful, especially the air component. If I'm right, if my sources are correct, a ground operation commenced either this week or is about to commence, especially in the northern fringes of Borno. So the gains being recorded by Operation Yanchin Tafki by the Nigerian military has definitely led to a reduction of the operations of both the two groups, the Boko Haram and the Islamic State in West Africa province.
Kabir, just because you raised this in your response, I just don't want to have that drop out there and us not follow up on it. And that is the IS, the global IS deconstruction and how that might affect IS West Africa. When you're talking about numbers of IS members moving into West Africa and the Sahel region, can you give us a sense of what those numbers are like? And also, how is IS West Africa funded? And will we see an increase in funding with what's happening globally in Syria and in other parts of that region affect the funding of IS West Africa? I just want you to shortly just give us a quick answer on that, because there's some other questions that my colleagues want to ask you. But since you raised it in your response, I didn't want to leave it out there.
All right. It's very difficult to give an exact number. It's actually one of the failures of our counterterrorism approach, where, unlike other countries like in Europe and probably America, they are able to know their citizens who join these global groups and monitor them when they are returning. You recall the recent debate about what to do with the returnee jihadists in Europe. We don't have that kind of monitoring system in Nigeria. So it's difficult to give an exact number of how many returnees. In terms of funding, what we know based on our monitoring of these groups is one of the major ways is through collection of ransom from kidnap incidences that they've carried out. Another one, of course, is the raiding of financial institutions, banks, and other financial institutions. Then they also collect what I would call tolls or dues from commercial operators in that area, fishermen, truck who are passing through their territories. And then also contribution from members. We cannot also exclude the possibility of influential members of especially the political, echelon who are supporting, through backdoor channels, these operations. So in a nutshell, that's their funding modus. How the links between the global IS and ISWAP, we don't think there is any funding link. Perhaps the transfer of technology, a little bit of it. Perhaps what they post on the internet in terms of how to put together a bomb, how to carry out an attack, maybe supporting the tactics and strategy of these groups. But so far, there hasn't been any credible intelligence suggesting direct funding by the global IS of Islamic State in West Africa province.
All right. Recently, the Nigerian army incorporated hundreds of repented members of Boko Haram. What does this say about the seriousness against the fight against insurgency? What do you make of that?
So the Nigerian counterterrorism approach has about four basic components. The military component, which I've been talking about in the last few minutes, then the diplomatic component, which I spoke about earlier on, and then lastly, you have the soft approach. In my analysis and assessment, I think part of the reason why the counterterrorism approach has not been very effective is because we've not laid a lot of emphasis on the last component, which is the soft approach. Now, under that component, you have about 3 or 4 basic elements. One of them is strategic communication, where the government agencies that speak to the public try to gain our support through language that we can understand. I don't think the Nigerian government has been doing very well. Then you have the economic development of the affected location, and then you have counter-radicalization and de-radicalization. Now, under de-radicalization is what the government has termed Operation Safe Corridor, and the release of that 150 plus de-radicalized members of Boko Haram came under that Operation Safe Corridor, where institutions have been established to train and give some form of skills, change their ideology, attempt to change their ideology from the radical, aggressive, killer ideology to a more receptive and more tolerant one. Now, based on the debriefing of the 150 plus de-radicalized members of Boko Haram, I think the effort has been quite successful. Now, what is 150 plus when you're talking of numbers of probably 1,000 or even more? I think it's a very small element. And what will happen when you release them to the outside society, where the same elements, issues that led them to become radicalized are still existing? Poverty, illiteracy, aggressive proselytization by some religious leaders. All those elements still exist in that society, and they are going back into that society. So while the effort may have been successful, it's, I think, not too far-fetched to say that, unfortunately, they would probably go back to where they started from.
Kabir, before we had a problem with your audio, we were asking you were answering our question regarding the de-radicalization of the repentant Boko Haram members. And I wanted to get a sense from you, when you look at that initiative in comparison to the initiatives we've had in places like Niger Delta and working with insurgency there, giving them skills, trying to get them to de-radicalize them as well. When you look at these type of initiatives across the country, how effective do you think they are? Because like you said, the underlying economic issues are still there. How do we balance these type of activities and make sure that they're effective? But I would like to get a sense from you of that comparison between the Northeast issue and also the Niger Delta issue.
I think it's a bit difficult, really, to make a comparison. They are very different. One is largely, the one in Niger Delta is, I would say, economic and to an extent socio-political, while the issue in the Northeast is purely ideological. Yes, the root causes are more or less the same: economic deprivation, bad governance, if you allow me to use that language. And then, of course, especially in the Northeast, the allegation that the security forces have been too heavy-handed in their approach, especially in tackling security issues that arose. So to that extent, I think making a comparison between the two is quite difficult. However, both options are the amnesty option in the Niger Delta, and then this Operation Safe Corridor in the Northeast have one objective, which is to remove the mindset by both sides that has embraced warfare and aggression to a more tolerant and more beneficial mindset. To that extent, I think both initiatives have been quite successful. However, like we pointed out, the same economic conditions that exist in the communities are still there. So no matter how you attempt to either give skill sets, change the mindset, you are still allowing these people to go back to those communities where the same conditions that led to their radicalization and aggression are still there. So it's just a matter of time, unfortunately, before the likelihood of them returning to the only way they know is happening. And I think that's where we are. A lot of these issues have been discussed in both the Northeast and the Niger Delta area.
Thank you.
Mr. Adamu, I want to talk about the victims that have been affected by these cases of insurgency and attacks. Previously, we said during the election there was a bit of a law, and now we have a situation where the victims are refusing to return home even though the government is attempting to rehabilitate a lot of them back in their homes. Now, we also know that a home is your sacred place. How do you feel that, or do you feel that the government is being successful in this, or do you feel like it's going to be a consistent problematic issue getting people to return back to their homes? Because at the end of the day, if you don't feel safe, regardless of what the situation is of them trying to control and tame down the insurgency and attacks, if you're not safe, you're not going to return home. So in a situation like this, where we do have a time where there are not attacks, and then once again attacks continue, what do you say, or how do you see this playing out?
If in terms of figures, we're talking of over 2 million people in just Borno State alone that have been affected by the insurgency and that are living in formal camps. Now, if you add the figure, which unfortunately nobody even has that figure, of those that are living in informal camps, by that I mean living with their relatives, living in locations that have not been identified by either government or development partners, only you can just understand the number of persons that we're talking about. Now, the government's desire, especially the Borno State government, which has done quite commendable work in terms of improving the living conditions of the affected persons in their locations. So houses have been built in several locations, including Bama, and name them. Currently, I think the outgoing governor has he stated the initiatives in several locations, and we saw what he did with the most recent case of Jacana, where the military asked the residents of Jacana to leave. I was very concerned with that development. For a military that is planning and interested in winning the hearts and minds of residents, and the only way where residents will support the military initiative, the counterterrorism campaign, is if they feel it's being done for them. And then you now have a situation where an entire community was asked to relocate without, frankly, any sense of decency in their relocation. By that, I mean every human being has some basic needs. If you provide those basic needs, then he will feel a bit, relaxed and probably understand why you are doing what you're doing. But we saw footages on TV where they were gathered under the sun with no form of shelter and any provision for the period while they were being moved. So how do you hope for that community to support whatever initiative you are doing? So to that extent, I think we're seeing a haphazard approach by the government in responding to the needs of the IDPs, internally displaced persons. Our development partners are doing an amazing work to the extent of what they can do. They have several initiatives out there. Some give food, some are involved in wash component, water and hygiene components, and then some are even providing shelter in those camps. NEMA and the state emergency management agencies are also doing their best. But frankly, based on my interaction with these IDPs, a lot of them would rather return home than stay in those camps. But the big elephant there is the security of the communities where they are returning to. The government, the state government and the federal government is doing its best in terms of assuring the residents, but the reality is that most of the locations outside of the capital, Maiduguri, are vulnerable to attacks, and at any moment in time that these groups, either Islamic State in West Africa province or Boko Haram, decide, they can attack any location actually outside the state capital, unfortunately.
Wow. That's going to be it for us this morning with you. Once again, we thank you for being here and really shedding a lot of light on the security issue in the Northeast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. We hope that the people that are displaced get back to their homes very soon.
Thank you.
It's time now for a short break. When we return, Charles Onwaku, a Rise News analyst and producer, will be joining us to review the top newspaper headlines from across the country. Stay with us.